On a crisp autumn morning in downtown Manhattan, two men who could have been mirror images of each other crossed paths outside the gleaming headquarters of Reynolds Global Enterprises. One wore a perfectly tailored three-piece suit worth more than most people's monthly salary, while the other clutched a worn backpack to his chest, his weathered jacket barely keeping out the morning chill. Thomas Reynolds, the 42-year-old CEO of Reynolds Global Enterprises, was running late for his board meeting, a rarity for someone known for his ruthless punctuality. As he hurried past the regular crowd of early morning commuters, his eyes locked with those of a man sitting on the sidewalk. The world seemed to stop for a moment. The homeless man's face was like looking into a mirror, but one that showed an alternate reality. Same sharp jawline, same deep-set brown eyes, same slight scar above the right eyebrow, even the same salt and pepper stubble. The only difference was the story their faces told, one weathered by harsh streets, the other pampered by luxury spas. Thomas couldn't move. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages about the waiting board members, but for the first time in decades, business wasn't his first priority. The homeless man, who called himself Ray, seemed equally stunned by their resemblance. "This is impossible," Thomas muttered, his usual composure cracking. Ray stood up slowly, his movements careful, as if any sudden motion might shatter this surreal moment. A small crowd of onlookers had begun to gather, phones discreetly recording this strange encounter. "Life's full of impossible things," Ray replied, his voice carrying the same deep timbre as Thomas's, but roughened by years of hardship. "I've been sitting on this corner for 3 months, watching you walk into that building every morning at exactly 7:30. Except today." Thomas's mind raced through possibilities, a long-lost twin, a bizarre coincidence, some elaborate prank. But deep down, he knew this meeting wasn't random. His own past held too many mysteries, too many unanswered questions about his early childhood before the Reynolds family adopted him. Instead of heading into his building, Thomas did something that would change both their lives forever. He turned to his assistant, who had been frantically trying to get his attention, and said, "Cancel everything. Clear my schedule for the day." The words felt foreign in his mouth. He hadn't taken an unexpected day off in 15 years. "Would you join me for breakfast?" Thomas asked Ray, gesturing toward his favorite local diner, a humble establishment that had somehow survived the neighborhood's gentrification. Ray hesitated, clutching his backpack tighter. Trust didn't come easily after years on the streets. "No catch," Thomas added, recognizing the wariness in his doppelganger's eyes. "Just breakfast and conversation. I think we might have some things to talk about." As they walked into the diner together, the contrast between them drew every eye in the place. The waitress nearly dropped her coffee pot when she did a double take. But as they settled into a quiet booth in the corner, something extraordinary began to unfold. Over plates of eggs and coffee, Ray's story emerged in pieces. He had grown up in the foster system, bouncing between homes until he aged out. He had a degree in engineering from a state university, earned through scholarships and determination. But a series of devastating personal losses, coupled with an economic downturn, had started a downward spiral that ended with him on the streets. What caught Thomas's attention wasn't just the parallels in their apparent physical appearance, but the similarities in their fundamental nature. Ray spoke with the same analytical precision that Thomas prided himself on. He asked probing questions about Thomas's business ventures that showed a keen understanding of market dynamics. Even their mannerisms, the way they stirred their coffee, the slight tilt of their head when considering a point, were eerily identical. As the morning wore on, Thomas's phone continued to buzz with increasingly urgent messages. The board meeting he'd skipped was about a potential merger worth billions. But sitting in that diner, listening to Ray's story, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense that he was exactly where he needed to be. "There's something I need to tell you," Ray said finally, his hands wrapped around his third cup of coffee. "The reason I've been watching your building isn't just coincidence. I've been trying to work up the courage to approach you for weeks. Because I found something in my foster care records, something about a twin brother who was separated from me during adoption. Thomas felt the world tilt slightly. The mysteries of his early childhood, the gaps in his adoption records, the strange dreams that had plagued him throughout his life, the inexplicable sense that something was missing, suddenly began to make sense. Their conversation continued well into the afternoon, moving from the diner to Thomas's private office on the top floor of his building. As they pieced together their shared history, a plan began to form in Thomas's mind. It wasn't just about helping Ray anymore, it was about correcting a historical wrong, about reuniting what should never have been separated. But neither man could have predicted how their reconnection would spiral into a series of events that would shake the foundations of New York's business world, challenge their understanding of family, and ultimately lead to a truth more extraordinary than either could have imagined. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Thomas had set Ray up in a luxury hotel suite 2 blocks from Reynolds Global Enterprises, but that was just the beginning. As they dug deeper into their shared past, both men felt an increasing sense of urgency to uncover the truth. The adoption agency that had handled their cases had closed decades ago, its records scattered across various state institutions. Thomas put his company's best private investigators on the task, but even with unlimited resources, piecing together a 40-year-old mystery proved challenging. "Look at this," Ray said one evening, spreading out yellowed documents across Thomas's penthouse dining table. He'd spent the day at the public library, combing through old newspapers. There was a fire at St. Mary's Children's Home in 1982, right around the time we would have been there. Several records were destroyed. Thomas leaned over the article, his expression thoughtful. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Almost like someone wanted certain information to disappear. The more they investigated, the more questions emerged. Why had they been separated? Who had made that decision? And most troublingly, why did some of the paperwork appear to have been deliberately altered? Their investigation hit its first major obstacle when Thomas received an anonymous email warning him to stop digging into the past. The sender claimed to have damaging information about Reynolds Global Enterprises that would be released if the brothers continued their search. "They're scared," Ray observed, his street-honed instincts picking up on something deeper. "But not of what we might find about ourselves. There's something bigger here." Thomas agreed, but the threat had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. He'd built his company from the ground up after the Reynolds family had cut him off for refusing to follow their career plans for him. Everything he had, he'd earned through his own determination and skill. Meanwhile, Ray was undergoing his own transformation. The hotel's address had allowed him to apply for jobs, and his engineering degree had quickly caught the attention of several firms. But he refused to accept any positions, focused entirely on solving the mystery of their separation. "I spent 20 years designing solutions for other people's problems," Ray explained when Thomas questioned his decision. "Maybe this is what I was meant to do instead." Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former nurse from St. Mary's, now in her 80s, reached out after seeing a news story about their reunion. Her hands shook as she showed them a personal diary she'd kept during her time at the home. There were rumors, she told them, her voice barely above a whisper, about wealthy families paying to handpick babies with certain characteristics. Twins were especially valuable. But I never had proof, until the night of the fire. According to her diary, the fire hadn't been an accident. She'd seen men in suits removing files before the blaze started. The next day, several children, including a pair of twin boys, were gone. The revelation hit both men hard. They weren't just victims of a flawed system, they had been deliberately separated as part of an organized scheme. Thomas threw himself into investigating the Reynolds family's connection to St. Mary's. His adoptive parents had passed away years ago, but their old records might hold clues. Ray, meanwhile, used his experience of living on the streets to gather information from unusual sources. Former staff members, distant relatives, anyone who might remember something about the children's home. Their shared mission had begun to draw media attention. Reporters camped outside Thomas's building, hoping to catch glimpses of the identical brothers. Social media buzzed with theories about their story. Some people claimed it was all a publicity stunt, while others saw it as a symbol of hope, a reminder that family connections could transcend any barrier. But not everyone was happy about their investigation. Thomas's board of directors called an emergency meeting, concerned about his increasing absence from day-to-day operations. Several major shareholders threatened to pull their investments if he didn't handle the situation more discreetly. "They can't touch me," Thomas assured Ray after a particularly tense board meeting. "I own controlling interest in the company. And even if I didn't." He paused, realizing something fundamental had shifted inside him. "Even if I didn't, this is more important." Ray understood. His years on the street had taught him that some things mattered more than money or status. The truth about their past was one of them. 1 month after their initial meeting, they received an encrypted message from someone claiming to be a former administrator at St. Mary's. The message contained coordinates to a storage facility in New Jersey and a warning: "What you're looking for is there. But be careful. Some secrets are kept hidden for a reason." As they drove to the location late that night, both men felt the weight of destiny. Whatever they found in that storage unit would change their lives forever. But neither could have predicted just how deep the conspiracy went, or how many powerful people had been involved in separating them. The storage unit key trembled in Thomas's hand as they stood before the rolled-down metal door. Ray placed a steadying hand on his brother's shoulder, a gesture that felt natural now, despite their short time knowing each other. "Whatever's in there," Ray said, his voice firm, "we face it together." Thomas nodded, inserted the key, and lifted the door. The beam of their flashlights revealed stacks of boxes, filing cabinets, and something that made both men catch their breath: a wall covered in photographs of children, arranged in pairs. They weren't the only twins who had been separated. And as they began to sift through the documents stored there, they realized their story was just the tip of a very dark iceberg, one that implicated some of the most powerful families on the East Coast in a decades-long conspiracy of greed and manipulation. The storage unit's contents painted a disturbing picture. Hundreds of files detailed a sophisticated operation spanning 3 decades. Wealthy families had paid enormous sums to adopt children with specific genetic traits, often separating twins to prevent future questions about their origins. Thomas and Ray spent hours photographing documents, their hands shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The wall of twin photographs seemed to watch them, dozens of pairs of identical faces, each separated by the same system that had torn them apart. "Look at this," Ray said, holding up a ledger. They tracked the children like investments. Regular updates on education, health, even personality development. His engineer's mind had already started organizing the information into patterns. They were running it like a business. Thomas recognized several family names in the ledger, prominent figures in banking, politics, and industry. The Reynolds family appeared multiple times. They weren't just buying babies, he realized. They were buying futures. Children with specific genetic markers for intelligence, creativity, leadership. A sudden noise outside the storage unit made both men freeze. Ray instinctively moved toward the shadows, old habits died hard. Thomas quickly packed the most important documents into his briefcase. They'd learned to trust their instincts over the past month. They slipped out through a back exit just as 2 black SUVs pulled into the storage facility. Through the chain-link fence, they watched men in dark suits enter the unit they'd just left. Their discovery wouldn't remain secret for long. Back at Thomas's penthouse, they began piecing together the bigger picture. The adoption scheme had been orchestrated by a group calling themselves the Heritage Initiative, wealthy families who believed they could engineer the next generation of American leaders through selective adoption. They played God with children's lives, Ray said, his voice heavy with emotion. split up families for their social experiment. He picked up one of the twin photographs they'd taken from the wall. How many others are out there, not knowing they have a sibling? Thomas was already making calls, pulling strings he'd never thought he'd use. By morning, he had assembled a team of investigators, journalists, and lawyers he trusted. The story needed to be told, but it had to be done right. The media explosion was immediate. News channels ran constant coverage of the developing scandal. Other twins separated by the Heritage Initiative began coming forward. Some had achieved remarkable success like Thomas, while others, like Ray, had faced tremendous hardships. The public was captivated by the brothers' story, the billionaire and the homeless man, separated by design but reunited by chance. Social media erupted with support, but also with threats from those who wanted to keep the past buried. Thomas's position at Reynolds Global Enterprises became increasingly precarious. Board members with connections to the Heritage Initiative pushed for his removal. Shareholders threatened legal action, claiming his personal vendetta was damaging the company's value. But Thomas had spent years preparing for corporate warfare. He knew where every skeleton was buried, every deal that had been made in shadows. "Try to remove me," he told the board, "and everything comes out. Not just the Heritage Initiative, but every corrupt deal you've ever made." Ray watched his brother's corporate battle with a mixture of pride and concern. He'd seen enough street fights to recognize when someone was backed into a corner. "You don't have to sacrifice everything," he told Thomas one evening. "We can find another way." Thomas smiled, looking more relaxed than he had in weeks. "I'm not sacrificing anything. For the first time, I'm fighting for something that matters." He gestured to the wall of evidence they'd assembled. These families thought they could buy success, engineer it like some product. But look at us, same genes, different paths, both ending up as fighters in our own ways. Their investigation revealed an even deeper connection to their past. Their biological mother had been a brilliant young scientist working on early genetic research. The Heritage Initiative had targeted her specifically, manipulating events to force her to give up her twin sons. "She never stopped looking for us," Ray said, reading through her letters to the adoption agency. "They drove her out of her career, destroyed her reputation, but she never gave up." His voice cracked slightly. "She's still alive, Thomas. Living in a small town in Oregon." The revelation hit them both hard. They had focused so much on exposing the conspiracy that they'd almost missed the most important discovery: they still had family out there, waiting. But before they could plan a trip to Oregon, the Heritage Initiative made its move. Thomas's private security team intercepted an assassination attempt, while Ray narrowly escaped a kidnapping outside his hotel. "They're desperate," Thomas observed, as they relocated to a secure location. "Which means we're close to something they really don't want us to find." Ray nodded, spreading out the latest batch of documents they'd decoded. "It's not just about the twins anymore. The Heritage Initiative was part of something bigger, a long-term plan to control key positions in government, finance, and technology. They literally tried to create a hidden dynasty." As they talked through the night, planning their next moves, both brothers felt a deepening sense of purpose. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore, or even for the other separated twins. They were fighting to expose a system that had tried to play God with people's lives. "Whatever happens," Ray said, looking at his brother, "I'm glad I found you." Thomas smiled, the same determination mirrored in his identical face. "We're going to finish this. And then we're going to find our mother." But the Heritage Initiative wasn't finished with them. As dawn broke over the city, they received word that someone had leaked their mother's location to the press. The race to reach her before their enemies would test every skill, every resource, and every ounce of courage they had discovered in each other. The small town of Pine Valley, Oregon, seemed frozen in time. As Thomas's private jet touched down at the regional airport, both brothers felt the weight of the moment. Somewhere in this peaceful community, their mother was waiting, though she didn't yet know her sons were coming. "We need to be careful," Ray cautioned as they drove through the town in their rented car. His years on the streets had taught him to spot surveillance, and something felt off. The press leak about her location wasn't random. "They're watching." Thomas nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He'd spent the flight calling in every favor he had, setting up a protective network around Pine Valley. But the Heritage Initiative had proven remarkably resourceful. Their mother, Dr. Grace Chen, lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town. She'd rebuilt her life here after the scientific community had shunned her, teaching chemistry at the local high school. According to their research, she was beloved by her students and known for helping underprivileged kids pursue careers in science. As they parked across the street from her house, both men felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. Through the kitchen window, they could see a woman in her 60s tending to a collection of plants. Her hair had gone silver, but her movements were precise and purposeful, just like theirs. "How do we do this?" Thomas whispered. For all his corporate experience, all his practiced speeches, he had no words for this moment. Ray's response was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. 3 black SUVs appeared at both ends of the street, moving with deliberate slowness. "They're here," Ray said, his body tensing. "We need to move. Now." Without hesitation, they rushed across the street. Ray's knock on the door was urgent but controlled. When Dr. Chen opened it, her eyes widened in shock. She staggered slightly, gripping the doorframe for support. "Inside," Thomas said quickly, gently guiding her back into the house as Ray secured the door. "We don't have much time." "I knew," she whispered, looking from one identical face to the other. "All these years, I knew you'd find each other." Tears streamed down her face as she reached out to touch their cheeks, one hand on each son. "My boys." The reunion was cut short by the sound of car doors slamming outside. Ray moved to the windows, assessing their situation. 6 men, professionally trained. They're surrounding the house. Thomas was already on his phone, activating his security team, but they were minutes away. Dr. Chen, however, remained surprisingly calm. "The basement," she said firmly, moving to a bookshelf. "I've been preparing for this day for 40 years. She pulled a hidden lever, revealing a concealed staircase. "And I've kept everything they tried to destroy." The basement was a revelation. One wall was covered with research papers, photographs, and connected strings, 40 years of investigation into the Heritage Initiative. Dr. Chen had never stopped working, never stopped gathering evidence. "They didn't just take you from me," she explained as they hurried down the stairs. "They stole my research, twisted it for their own purposes. I was developing ways to identify genetic markers for diseases, to help people. They turned it into a eugenics program." The sound of breaking glass upstairs spurred them into action. Dr. Chen moved to a safe hidden behind a false wall, quickly retrieving a hard drive and a stack of documents. "Everything is here," she said. "Every experiment, every adoption, every family involved. I tracked them all." She pressed the hard drive into Thomas's hands. "This is why they're really afraid. It's not just about the twins anymore. It's about decades of genetic manipulation, about children bred and selected like prize horses." Ray had taken up position near the stairs, ready to defend their position. Thomas was coordinating with his security team through text, trying to buy them time. But Dr. Chen wasn't finished. "There's more," she said, her voice urgent. The Heritage Initiative was just the beginning. They've started a new program, using advanced genetic engineering. They're trying to create what they call the perfect generation. We have to stop them." The sounds of searching upstairs grew closer. Thomas's phone buzzed, his security team was 2 minutes out. But the Heritage Initiative's men would find the basement door before then. Dr. Chen pulled out one final item, a small USB drive on a chain around her neck. This contains everything they never knew I discovered. Their current experiments, their future plans, everything. I've spent years infiltrating their network, gathering proof. She pressed the drive into Ray's hands. You two were my greatest achievement, not because of genetics, but because you found each other despite everything they did to prevent it. You proved that their whole theory was wrong. Love and human connection can't be engineered or controlled. The basement door burst open. In the chaos that followed, Ray's street fighting skills and Thomas's hired security clashed with the Heritage Initiative's men. Dr. Chen's basement became a battleground, decades of carefully gathered evidence hanging in the balance. But in the end, it wasn't force that won the day, it was preparation. Dr. Chen had planned for this moment for 40 years. Every piece of evidence had been digitally backed up to secure servers. The Heritage Initiative had come to silence them, but they were too late. As police sirens wailed in the distance, the three of them huddled in the basement, holding onto each other. They had found more than just evidence, they had found each other. Dr. Chen held her sons close, for decades of separation dissolving in their embrace. I never lost hope, she told them, her voice strong despite everything. And now, we have work to do. The Heritage Initiative needs to be exposed, not just for what they did to us, but for what they're planning to do to a new generation of children. Thomas and Ray exchanged determined looks. Their journey had started with a chance meeting outside a corporate building. Now it had become something much bigger, a fight for justice, truth, and the simple human right to choose one's own destiny. As they emerged from the basement into the morning light, all three knew that their real battle was just beginning. The Heritage Initiative's new genetic engineering program had to be stopped. But this time, they would fight together, a family united by both blood and purpose. The world exploded with the release of Dr. Chen's evidence. Major news networks ran round-the-clock coverage of what they called the Heritage Scandal. Thousands of families came forward, suspecting they might have been part of the initiative's programs. DNA testing companies reported an unprecedented surge in requests from adults searching for possible twins. Thomas had converted the entire top floor of Reynolds Global Enterprises into a command center. Screens displayed news coverage from around the world, while teams of lawyers and investigators worked through Dr. Chen's extensive files. Ray's engineering background proved invaluable as they processed the technical data, while Dr. Chen filled in the gaps from her decades of research. They're already trying to discredit us, Ray observed, watching a news segment where a Heritage Initiative spokesman dismissed their evidence as elaborate conspiracy theories. His time on the streets had taught him how powerful people manipulated the truth. But they can't hide from DNA evidence. He was right. The genetic testing results were undeniable. Dozens of separated twins had already been matched, their stories eerily similar to Thomas and Ray's. Some reunions were joyous, others complicated by decades of divergent lives. Each pair served as living proof of the initiative's manipulation. Dr. Chen spent hours examining the latest genetic engineering data they'd uncovered. This is far more advanced than anything we dreamed possible 40 years ago, she explained, her face grave. They're not just selecting traits anymore, they're attempting to modify them. Thomas leaned over her shoulder, studying the complex diagrams. Where are they doing this research? These facilities must leave some kind of trail. They've learned from their mistakes, Dr. Chen replied. Instead of centralizing everything like they did with St. Mary's, they've scattered their operations across multiple countries, using shell companies and offshore accounts. Ray, who had been quietly analyzing financial records, looked up. Maybe we're approaching this wrong. We're looking for research facilities, but what if we track the money instead? His suggestion led to a breakthrough. Using Thomas's business expertise and banking connections, they began mapping the flow of funds through the initiative's complex network. Patterns emerged, pointing to a series of seemingly unrelated fertility clinics across the country. But their investigation didn't go unnoticed. The Heritage Initiative launched a coordinated counterattack. Media outlets sympathetic to their cause began running stories questioning Dr. Chen's credibility. Anonymous sources claimed she had been fired from her original research position for unethical practices. "They're trying to control the narrative," Thomas said during a late-night strategy session. "We need to get ahead of this." Dr. Chen straightened in her chair, a familiar determination in her eyes. "Then it's time I tell my full story. No more hiding." The interview was arranged with a respected international news network. As Dr. Chen calmly detailed her decades-long journey, from brilliant young scientist to devastated mother to determined investigator, millions watched in rapt attention. She explained the science in terms anyone could understand, helping people grasp the true scope of the initiative's actions. "They presented themselves as helping families," she explained to the interviewer. "Matching children with parents who could give them every advantage. But they were really conducting a massive social experiment, playing with people's lives like pieces on a chess board." The public response was overwhelming. More whistleblowers came forward, nurses, administrators, even former members of the initiative itself. Each new testimony added weight to their case. But the most shocking revelation came from an unexpected source. A junior executive at one of Thomas's subsidiary companies reached out privately, claiming to have information about current Heritage Initiative operations. The meeting was arranged at a quiet diner, the same one where Thomas and Ray had first talked months ago. The executive, visibly nervous, slid a tablet across the table. "They're not just using fertility clinics," she explained in a whisper. "They've infiltrated major genetic research companies. The modified embryo program, it's already operational. There are children being born right now." The implications were staggering. While they had been focused on exposing past crimes, the initiative had moved forward with their plans for genetic engineering. They were literally attempting to create a new generation of carefully modified children. Ray studied the data on the tablet, his engineering mind quickly grasping the technical details. These modifications, they're not just targeting physical traits or intelligence. They're trying to engineer personality traits, ambition, leadership, obedience. Playing God wasn't enough for them, Dr. Chen said softly. Now they want to create their own gods. The revelation spurred them into action. Thomas immediately began leveraging his business connections to identify companies involved in the program. Ray worked with a team of ethical hackers to penetrate the initiative's secure networks. Dr. Chen collaborated with trusted colleagues to understand the full implications of the genetic modifications. But as they dug deeper, they discovered something even more disturbing. The Heritage Initiative wasn't working alone. Their tentacles reached into government agencies, regulatory bodies, and major corporations. They had spent decades building a network of influence that extended far beyond adoption and genetics. "This is bigger than we imagined," Thomas said, looking out over the nighttime city from his office window. "We're not just fighting a secret organization anymore. We're fighting an entire system." Ray stood beside his brother, their identical reflections overlapping in the glass. "Then we'll need to build our own network. People are angry, Thomas. Once they understand what's really happening, they'll want justice." Dr. Chen joined her sons, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "We have something the initiative never understood, the power of truth and human connection. They tried to engineer perfect human beings, but they forgot what makes us human in the first place." As they stood together, watching the city lights below, all three knew they were standing on the brink of something historic. The Heritage Initiative's house of cards was beginning to crumble, but its fall would shake the foundations of society. The question was, were they ready for what would emerge from the ruins? The morning headlines screamed across every major newspaper: Heritage Initiative linked 2 government contracts. The story broke like a tsunami, revealing decades of classified genetic research funded by shadowy government agencies. Public outrage reached a fever pitch as people realized their tax dollars had supported these experiments. Inside the Reynolds Global Command Center, Thomas, Ray, and Dr. Chen worked tirelessly with their growing team of allies. The whistleblowers' information had opened floodgates they hadn't anticipated. "Look at these contracts," Ray said, pointing to financial documents displayed on the wall screens. His years of living on nothing had given him an eagle eye for following money trails. They were running parallel programs, one public, one secret. The fertility clinics were just the surface. Dr. Chen nodded grimly, studying genetic sequencing data from the modified embryo program. "They've made breakthroughs that should be impossible with current technology. Unless..." Her voice trailed off as realization dawned. "Unless what, Mom?" Thomas asked, still marveling at how natural that word felt after just a few months. "Unless they've been conducting unauthorized human trials for years," she finished. "These results, they could only come from multiple generations of testing." The implications hit them all hard. Somewhere out there were children, perhaps even adults, who had been unknowing test subjects for the initiative's genetic modifications. Their investigation gained unexpected support when a group of ethical genetic researchers came forward. These scientists had been tracking anomalous genetic patterns in certain populations, patterns that couldn't be explained by natural evolution. "They're creating a genetic divide," one researcher explained during a secure video conference. "Not just between rich and poor, but between modified and unmodified humans. If this continues, in a few generations we could be looking at two distinct subspecies." The news triggered worldwide protests. People demanded genetic testing to determine if they or their children had been part of the initiative's experiments. Fertility clinics were stormed by angry clients. Major genetic research companies saw their stock prices plummet as investors fled. But the Heritage Initiative wasn't going down without a fight. They launched a massive PR campaign, presenting their work as the next step in human evolution. They branded their critics as Luddites who would hold back scientific progress. "We stand at the threshold of humanity's next great leap forward," their spokesman declared on national television. "The ability to eliminate genetic diseases, enhance human capabilities, ensure our children have every possible advantage, these are gifts we cannot reject out of fear." The message resonated with some. Support for genetic enhancement began growing, particularly among wealthy families who could afford the procedures. The public debate grew increasingly heated. Through it all, Thomas and Ray's story remained a powerful symbol. Talk shows couldn't get enough of the twins separated by the initiative, one guided toward wealth and power, the other left to struggle on the streets. Their reunion and subsequent investigation had captured the public's imagination. "We need to shift the conversation," Ray suggested during a strategy session. "This isn't about technology, it's about consent and control. No one asked us if we wanted to be part of their experiment. No one asked any of the children they separated." Dr. Chen had been unusually quiet that day, poring over newly uncovered research files. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with concern. "The modified embryo program, it's worse than we thought. They're not just enhancing existing genes. They're introducing entirely new genetic sequences, ones that don't exist in human DNA." She pulled up complex molecular diagrams on the screens. "These modifications are designed to be hereditary. Any children born from this program will pass these changes on to their own children. They're literally trying to create a new human bloodline." The revelation spurred Thomas into action. He immediately called an emergency press conference, broadcasting live from the Reynolds Global headquarters. "Today, we're releasing evidence of genetic manipulation that goes beyond anything previously disclosed," he announced, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "The Heritage Initiative isn't just separating families or selecting traits. They're attempting to fundamentally alter the course of human evolution, without public knowledge or consent." Ray stood beside his brother at the podium, their identical faces presenting a powerful visual reminder of what was at stake. "We're also announcing the creation of the Human Genetic Rights Foundation," he added. "This organization will provide free genetic testing to anyone who suspects they may have been part of the initiative's programs, and legal support for affected families." Dr. Chen then stepped forward, her presence commanding immediate respect. "As a scientist, I understand the allure of genetic advancement. But as a mother who had her children stolen and separated, I know the human cost of unchecked ambition. We're calling for an immediate worldwide moratorium on genetic modification of human embryos." The press conference was still ongoing when they received urgent news. Multiple break-ins had been reported at genetic research facilities across the country. Someone was destroying evidence. "They're trying to cover their tracks," Thomas realized. "Which means we're close to something big." Ray was already coordinating with their security team, using his street smarts to predict likely targets. "We need to protect the remaining facilities. Whatever they're trying to hide must be crucial." Dr. Chen studied the pattern of break-ins on a digital map. "These aren't random targets. They're systematically destroying specific research records. They're hiding something about the modified embryo program, something we haven't discovered yet." As they raced to protect the remaining facilities, none of them could shake the feeling that they were approaching a point of no return. The Heritage Initiative's true endgame was still hidden, but one thing was becoming clear: the future of human evolution hung in the balance. And somewhere in the shadows, the architects of this grand experiment were preparing their final move. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning. Dr. Chen burst into Thomas's office, where he and Ray had been coordinating security for the remaining research facilities. Her hands trembled as she placed a laptop on the desk. "I know what they're hiding," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "The genetic modifications, the facility break-ins, the rush to destroy evidence, it all connects to something they called Project Legacy." The brothers leaned in as she pulled up encrypted files they'd recovered from the latest facility raid. The documents revealed a truth more shocking than anything they'd imagined. The Heritage Initiative wasn't just creating enhanced children, Dr. Chen explained, pointing to complex genetic sequences. They were creating a fail-safe. A genetic trigger they could activate in future generations. Ray's engineering mind quickly grasped the implications. They built a kill switch into the DNA. "More like a control switch," Dr. Chen corrected. "The modified genes contain sequences that can be activated by specific chemical compounds. Once activated, they can influence everything from physical capabilities to basic behavioral patterns." Thomas sat back, stunned. They wanted to create an entire population they could control with the flip of a switch. Not just the children, but their children's children. "And anyone who married into these bloodlines," Ray added, thinking of the broader implications. The modifications would spread through the population naturally over generations. The scale of the plan was staggering. The Heritage Initiative hadn't just been planning for years or decades, they'd been planning for centuries. They were attempting to create a genetic dynasty they could control long after they were gone. As they processed this revelation, their secure phones buzzed simultaneously. The warning they'd feared had arrived. Multiple Heritage Initiative facilities had begun destroying their genetic samples and research data. "They know we've figured it out," Thomas said, already moving into action. "We need to secure proof before they can destroy it all." The next 12 hours became a race against time. Thomas deployed his corporate resources, Ray activated his network of street contacts, and Dr. Chen coordinated with scientific allies around the world. They had to preserve evidence of Project Legacy before it vanished forever. But the Heritage Initiative had prepared for this moment. As the Chen-Reynolds team approached each facility, they found increasingly sophisticated resistance. Private security forces, corrupt local officials, and even military contractors stood in their way. "They're not just protecting research anymore," Ray observed as they regrouped after another blocked attempt. They're protecting their vision of the future. Dr. Chen had been analyzing data from the facilities they'd managed to access. The genetic triggers, they're not theoretical. They've already started activating them in small test groups. She showed them medical records they'd recovered. Children from the program had exhibited sudden changes in physical capabilities and behavior patterns after routine wellness checks at initiative-controlled clinics. These kids had no choice, Thomas said, his voice heavy with anger. Their whole lives, their very DNA, is being manipulated without their knowledge. The story exploded across international media. The idea that a secret organization could literally control future generations through genetic manipulation struck a primal chord of fear in people worldwide. Protests erupted outside genetic research facilities globally. Parents demanded to know if their fertility treatments had been part of the initiative's programs. Governments scrambled to respond, launching investigations and freezing research permits. But the Heritage Initiative had one final card to play. They released a carefully crafted statement that sent shockwaves through the global community. The modifications are already too widespread to stop. Hundreds of thousands of children carry these enhanced genes. They are stronger, smarter, and better adapted to humanity's future challenges. Would you deny them and their descendants these advantages? Would you force them to be ordinary? The message created exactly the division they'd hoped for. Some parents who discovered their children carried modified genes began defending the program. Support groups formed around the idea of genetic enhancement rights. This is what they wanted, Dr. Chen realized. Social pressure to accept their modifications as the new normal. Once that happens, unmodified humans would become second-class citizens within a few generations. Ray had been unusually quiet, studying Project Legacy's technical specifications. There might be a way to neutralize the trigger sequences, he said finally. Not remove the modifications, but prevent them from being activated externally. Can it be done safely? Thomas asked, thinking of all the children who carried these modified genes. Dr. Chen reviewed Ray's calculations. Theoretically, yes. We could develop a treatment that would lock the genetic sequences in their current state. The enhanced traits would remain, but the Heritage Initiative would lose their control switch. It's not a perfect solution, Ray admitted. But it protects people's autonomy. Their enhanced genes would become just another part of natural human diversity. As they discussed the possibility, Thomas received an urgent message. The Heritage Initiative's leadership had requested a private meeting. They were willing to negotiate. It's a trap, Ray said immediately, his street instincts flaring. Probably, Thomas agreed. But it's also an opportunity. While they're focused on us, our teams could access their main research facility. Dr. Chen looked at her sons with worry. They're dangerous cornered. If they realize what we're planning. We'll be careful, Thomas assured her. But this might be our only chance to find their master database of modified genetic sequences. Without that, we can't develop the treatment to help everyone affected. As they began planning their most dangerous operation yet, all three knew they were approaching the endgame. The Heritage Initiative's decades-long experiment in human evolution was about to face its greatest challenge. The question was, how far would they go to protect their vision of humanity's future? The Heritage Initiative's headquarters occupied the top floors of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Manhattan. As Thomas and Ray rode the elevator up to the executive level, both brothers felt the weight of what was at stake. Through their hidden earpieces, they could hear their mother coordinating the simultaneous operation at the main research facility. Remember, Dr. Chen's voice came through clearly, we just need to keep them talking for 30 minutes. That's how long our team needs to access their secure servers. The elevator doors opened to reveal a spectacular view of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. 5 elderly men and women sat around a massive conference table, their combined wealth greater than the GDP of many nations. These were the true architects of Project Legacy. Mr. Reynolds, the woman at the head of the table, smiled warmly. And Mr. Reynolds, please, have a seat. We have much to discuss. Indeed we do, Thomas replied, taking his place at the table while Ray remained standing, his street-honed instincts keeping him alert. Starting with why you separated us at birth. A regrettable necessity, another board member spoke up. We needed to understand nature versus nurture in genetic development. Your results were fascinating. Ray's jaw tightened. We were children, not lab rats. You were the future, the woman corrected. Both of you. Different paths, different environments, yet look how remarkably similar you turned out. Both natural leaders, both brilliant in your own ways. You proved our theories correct. Meanwhile, across the city, Dr. Chen's team was making progress. Ethical hackers had penetrated the facility's outer security, while genetic researchers stood ready to download and analyze the Project Legacy database. Back in the meeting, the initiative's leadership laid out their proposition. They would allow the twins to join their inner circle, to help guide humanity's genetic future. In return, Thomas and Ray would halt their investigation and support the initiative's public narrative. Think of the possibilities, one board member urged. No more genetic diseases. Enhanced immunity. Extended lifespans. We're offering humanity the next stage of evolution. Through control and manipulation, Thomas countered. Playing God with people's lives without their knowledge or consent. The woman at the head of the table sighed. We predicted you might be idealistic. Perhaps a demonstration would help. She pressed a button on the table, and screens lit up around the room. These are live feeds from some of our test subjects. Watch what happens when we activate their enhanced genes. Horror crossed both brothers' faces as they watched children suddenly display increased strength, altered behavior patterns, and even physical changes, all triggered by chemical compounds in their routine medications. Stop it, Ray demanded, his voice tight with anger. They're not your puppets. They're the future, the woman corrected. A future we control. And speaking of control. She smiled coldly. Did you really think we wouldn't know about your team's raid on our facility? Dr. Chen's voice crackled urgently in their earpieces. They're ready for us. Security teams are moving in. We need more time. Thomas maintained his composure, years of corporate negotiations serving him well. If you knew about the raid, why let us in here? Because we wanted you to understand the futility of resistance, another board member explained. Project Legacy isn't just a program, it's inevitable. Humanity will evolve. We're just guiding that evolution. But they had underestimated the brothers' preparation. While the initiative had focused on the facility raid, they'd missed Ray's team quietly infiltrating their backup servers. As the board members gloated, Ray received the signal he'd been waiting for. You're right about one thing, he said, stepping forward. Evolution is inevitable. But it won't be controlled by you. With perfect timing, every screen in the room switched to display the full Project Legacy database, genetic sequences, trigger compounds, test results, everything. The data was being broadcast live across the internet, impossible to contain. What have you done? The woman demanded, her composure finally cracking. We've given people choice, Thomas answered. Dr. Chen, our mother, has already developed a treatment to neutralize your trigger sequences. Anyone with modified genes can choose to keep their enhancements while blocking external control. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with the revelations. News helicopters surrounded the building. Police and federal agents were already on their way up. But the initiative had one final surprise. Security teams burst into the room, weapons drawn. The board members rose, their grandfatherly facades dropping away. If we can't guide humanity's evolution, the lead woman declared, then perhaps it's time for a reset. Our facilities worldwide have contingency protocols. With one command, we can activate all modified genes simultaneously. Imagine the chaos. She never got to finish. Ray moved with the speed and precision learned from years of survival, sweeping her legs while Thomas disarmed the nearest guard. Dr. Chen's voice came through their earpieces, "We've got it. The full database is secured." The next few hours passed in a blur of federal arrests, media statements, and worldwide reactions. The Heritage Initiative's leadership was taken into custody. Their facilities were secured. Most importantly, their control over the modified genes they'd created was permanently broken. 1 month later, Thomas, Ray, and Dr. Chen stood together at a press conference announcing the results of their work. The Human Genetic Rights Foundation had successfully developed treatments to free modified individuals from external control while preserving their enhanced capabilities. The choice now belongs to each person, Dr. Chen explained to the world. Whether to keep their genetic modifications or reverse them. The power is where it always should have been, in the hands of the individuals themselves. The aftermath brought changes none of them had expected. Ray's engineering skills and street smarts proved invaluable in rebuilding Reynolds Global Enterprises into an ethical genetic research company. Thomas found himself enjoying the role of supportive brother more than corporate CEO. Dr. Chen's reputation was restored, her decades of secret research finally recognized. But most importantly, they had found each other. One evening, as they sat together in Thomas's penthouse watching the sunset, Ray voiced what they all felt. "You know what the initiative never understood," he said, looking at his brother and mother. "You can't engineer the things that really matter. Love, loyalty, family, those come from the heart, not DNA." Dr. Chen squeezed both her son's hands. "They thought separating you would prove their theories about genetic destiny. Instead, you proved that human connection is stronger than any genetic programming." Thomas nodded, thinking of their journey from that first chance meeting outside his building. Maybe that's the real evolution they feared, not genetic modifications, but the power of people to choose their own path, to find their own family, to write their own destiny. As the sun set over the city, they knew their story would inspire generations to come. Not as a tale of genetic engineering and corporate conspiracies, but as proof that the strongest bonds aren't written in DNA, but in the choices we make and the love we share. The Heritage Initiative had tried to control humanity's future. Instead, they had unleashed something far more powerful, the truth that every person's destiny belongs to them alone.